Nations do not have friends, they have interests. Right now, a shadow war is exploding across the Middle East, and the United States is running a very familiar playbook. You have probably seen the headlines. Airstrikes hitting the Iran-Iraq border. The Trump administration directly calling Kurdish opposition leaders. The CIA quietly setting the stage for a massive ground insurgency inside Iran. The goal is simple: break the Iranian regime from the inside, bleed their military dry by forcing them to fight a guerrilla war in their own backyard. But this strategy of arming rebels, funding insurgents, and making deals with former enemies is nothing new. It is the exact same strategy that turned a wanted jihadist into the current president of Syria. It is the same strategy the CIA used to humiliate the Soviet Union in the 1980s. We are going inside the Proxy Playbook. We are going to look at how superpowers outsource their wars, how they finance rebel groups to do their dirty work, and what happens when those temporary alliances inevitably fall apart. Let's start with what is happening right now. In March 2026, the US and Israel are actively targeting Iranian military infrastructure. But air power alone rarely wins wars. You need boots on the ground. And Washington does not want to send American boots into the meat grinder of a ground invasion in Iran. Enter the Kurds. Iranian Kurds make up about 10% of Iran's population. They have spent decades organizing armed groups like the KDPI. Recently, 5 major Kurdish opposition factions formed a unified coalition. Their stated goal is the complete overthrow of the Iranian government. For the CIA, this is the perfect geopolitical weapon. Look at the geography. The border between Iraq and Iran is dominated by the Zagros Mountains. It is incredibly rugged, unforgiving terrain. If you have ever tried to navigate jagged, unbroken mountain ridges, you know exactly how impossible it is for a conventional military to maneuver. It is a nightmare for tanks. It is paradise for light infantry and guerrilla fighters. Reports from multiple intelligence sources and major outlets indicate the US is offering extensive air cover and logistical support if Kurdish fighters cross the border from northern Iraq into western Iran. By establishing strongholds in those mountains, the Kurds can force Tehran to divert massive amounts of troops away from the broader regional conflict. The US government officially denies this, of course, they have to. Plausible deniability is rule number 1 of proxy warfare. But the Kurds are cautious, and they should be. The US has a long history of using Kurdish fighters when it suits American interests, and then abandoning them the second the political winds shift. If you want to see how fast a superpower will rewrite its own rules, look at Damascus. For over a decade, Ahmed al-Sharaa was public enemy number 1. He led a designated terrorist organization in Syria. The United States government literally put a $10 million bounty on his head. Today, he is the president of Syria. In late 2025, the US hosted al-Sharaa at the White House. The administration lifted massive sanctions that had crippled the country for years. The US military is now actively coordinating intelligence with his government. Why the sudden change of heart? Because al-Sharaa won the Syrian civil war, and Washington realized they needed a strongman to keep the country from fracturing and falling under Iranian or Russian control. The US government looked at a former jihadist and decided he was the best option for regional stability. But to back al-Sharaa, the US had to abandon the very people who actually fought ISIS on the ground for them, the Syrian Kurds. For years, the US armed and funded the Kurdish-led SDF. They were America's primary proxy force in the region. But the moment al-Sharaa solidified his power, US policy shifted overnight. The US pushed the Kurds to integrate their forces into al-Sharaa's national army and began withdrawing American troops from key border bases. The Syrian Kurds were a tool for a specific problem. Once the problem changed, the tool was discarded. This is the brutal math of proxy warfare. You use a local force to do your bleeding for you, and you leave them behind when the math no longer adds up. And nobody understands this cycle better than the CIA, because they perfected it in the 1980s. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the CIA launched Operation Cyclone. It remains one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in American history. The US did not send American soldiers to fight the Soviets. Instead, they funneled billions of dollars and cutting-edge weapons, like the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, to the Mujahideen. The strategy was identical to the plan being discussed for the Kurds in Iran today: arm a fierce local resistance and force a massive, conventional military into an unwinnable guerrilla war. It worked perfectly. The Mujahideen bled the Soviet army dry, forcing a humiliating withdrawal that helped collapse the Soviet Union itself. But Washington did not stick around to help rebuild. They packed up their funding and left a heavily armed, radicalized power vacuum. The proxy fighters the US celebrated as freedom fighters in the 80s eventually fractured, giving rise to the Taliban and providing a safe haven for al-Qaeda. The pattern repeats itself across decades. In the 1980s, the US backed Saddam Hussein with intelligence and resources because he was fighting a brutal war against Iran. He was their proxy against Tehran. In Panama, the CIA worked closely with Manuel Noriega. Both men were eventually removed from power by massive American military invasions when they stopped serving US interests and became liabilities. A proxy is only as valuable as the current crisis, which brings us back to today and the mountains of western Iran. The CIA is making promises. The Kurds are weighing their options. The Afghan trap is a classic example of funding rebels, but the playbook goes much deeper. Superpowers will also back the head of a sovereign state if it serves their interests. Throughout the 1980s, the United States viewed the new Islamic Republic in Iran as the ultimate threat in the Middle East. To contain Tehran, Washington needed a blunt instrument. They found one in neighboring Iraq. They backed Saddam Hussein. Saddam launched a brutal, grinding war against Iran. Publicly, the US claimed neutrality. Privately, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency were feeding Iraq crucial satellite imagery and tactical data. The US extended billions in credit to keep Iraq's economy afloat. Saddam was the perfect proxy. He absorbed massive casualties to fight America's enemy. The US turned a blind eye to his domestic atrocities because he served a massive strategic purpose. The exact same dynamic played out in Central America. Manuel Noriega was on the CIA payroll for years. He was Washington's man in Panama, helping the US funnel arms to the Contras in Nicaragua. He was incredibly useful. The moment Noriega's drug trafficking and political defiance became a liability, the US military invaded Panama and arrested him. A decade later, the US did the exact same thing to Saddam. The proxy of the 1980s became the target of the 2000s, which brings us back to today. The current mobilization of the Kurds on the Iranian border follows this exact historical pattern. The coalition of political forces of Iranian Kurdistan is preparing for a war of liberation. They hope American air power and logistical support will finally help them topple the regime in Tehran. But history offers a harsh warning. Superpowers never fund proxies out of charity. They fund them to solve immediate geopolitical problems. The US wants to break Iran's internal security and divert the Revolutionary Guard away from the broader regional war. The Kurds are offering to be the hammer. But what happens when the nail is finally driven in? What happens if a new government takes over in Tehran and Washington decides they need a unified Iran, just like they decided they needed a unified Syria under Ahmed al-Sharaa? The proxy playbook relies on a brutal truth. In the high-stakes game of global empire, local fighters take all the physical risk, while the superpower holds all the strategic cards. The alliances are always temporary, the interests are permanent,